Hello and welcome. You are watching Lockdown TV. This is the pop-up news and discussion program from unheard.com. Welcome in particular to all of our new subscribers. We have over 10,000 new subscribers to our YouTube channel since about a week ago, thanks to a couple of interviews that have gone huge. Around 765,000 people watched our interview with Swedish Professor Julian Jessop. So we're delighted about that. Our plan, so that you know, is to bring a bit of a variety to this channel. So we will be doing more in-depth 30-minute interviews, such as the ones we did with Professor Ferguson and Jessop. On that note, we have Yanis Varoufakis coming to talk to us on Wednesday. But we're also experimenting with some other formats. And today we are looking to try something along the lines of a debate. So first of all, let me welcome our guests. We have from Italy, Thomas Fazi, the economist and writer, and can I call you a lecturer, Thomas? Is that a thing in Italy?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. And with us also is Julian Jessop, another economist and writer and fellow of the IEA, the Institute for Economic Affairs. So the question that we are here to try and work out is whether this COVID-19 crisis will kill neoliberalism. So this is a piece that Thomas wrote for us at Unheard, and Julian then wrote a rebuttal of. So we want to give a forum here for them to have it out and see if we can get some progress on these questions. A lot of big world views have come into question during this crisis. Neoliberalism is one of those funny words that tends to be used by people who don't like it. There aren't that many people who describe themselves as neoliberal, but Julian, you are here to, as it were, defend the neoliberal side. Are you happy to be described as a neoliberal?
Yes, for these purposes. I tend to think of myself a bit more as a classical liberal, or maybe even ordo-liberal, but neoliberal is absolutely fine by me for today.
Okay, so let's get straight into it. Thomas, the world that we've been used to for the past few decades of diminished role for the nation state, big international networks of finance and corporations, money and people and goods flowing around. Roughly, that is what people understand to mean by neoliberalism. And you think that COVID-19 and the crisis we've seen in the past 2 months has exploded the myths of that system, and we can't go back to that.
Hello to everyone. Well, in fact, in the article, I don't argue that the COVID-19 crisis will kill neoliberalism or vanquish it. You guys chose that title. In fact, in the article, I argue that the elites are very good at reinventing themselves, at adapting to changing situations. We saw this after the 2008 crisis, which also seemed to shatter a lot of myths about public spending, deficits, debt, and so on. But that didn't bring about a progressive change. In fact, it brought about a doubling down of neoliberalism. So there's no reason to believe that the crisis in itself will kill neoliberalism. That depends much.
Just so we can get into those points you did make. So it remains to be seen what will actually happen, and I agree. You weren't sure what will happen after this, but you went through a number of kind of key areas which you thought the crisis had basically exposed. You called them the shibboleths. The first one was the money supply question. Is that right?
Well, yes, that's the most interesting one. So, yes, what I argue in the article is that this crisis is shattering a lot of myths that neoliberalism has spun over the past years and decades. And this includes the nature of money, how public spending works, the nature of globalization, the role of the state in an economy, and so on. But I think, yes, as you mentioned, the myth that has been exposed more than any other by this crisis is the idea that money is a scarce resource. That is the idea that there's a pot of money somewhere in the economy, and all governments can do is try to grab some of that money and then spend it. This is a narrative that we've been hearing for decades now. And in fact, what I find interesting is how neoliberals now are trying to say that they've never actually said all these things. And so even Julian in his article says, oh, but everyone acknowledges that money is not a scarce resource. No one's ever said that. But we know anyone who hasn't lived under a rock or in a cave for the past 30 years knows that not to be true. In fact, what we've been hearing for decades is that if a government spends too much, it's like maxing out on your credit card, which means that sooner or later the government will face bankruptcy, just like you and me would face bankruptcy if we rack up too much debt. We've been hearing that our governments have run out of money. President Obama actually said this in 2011. He said, yes, he said this on live TV. Yes, the US economy is running out of money. And I think this harks all the way back to a famous speech that Margaret Thatcher gave in 1983, where she said that, and I quote, "There's no such thing as public money. There's only taxpayer money. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can only do so by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more." Now, some of us have been saying for years that this is an outright lie. This is not how monetary sovereign governments work. Indeed, governments that issue their own currency, as the word says, issue the currency, which means that they don't have to tax before they can spend. They don't have to borrow on capital markets if they want to run a deficit. They can simply create the money literally out of thin air. And anyone who dared to say this in the past years was met with ridicule. We've read countless articles ridiculing the magic money tree argument, saying, "Oh, these people think there's a magic money tree somewhere that you can just shake and get all the money you want to finance whatever you want." And so this is a narrative we've been hearing for decades. And I think anyone that's been living in this world, or at least in the West for the past decades, can testify to that. And what we're seeing now is that this lie has been exposed by the fact that over the course of a few weeks, practically every major government in the world has announced huge spending plans, deficit spending plans, which it is practically acknowledged by everyone will be monetized by the respective central banks of those countries. Indeed, we've seen countless articles in the Financial Times and other conservative, neoliberal, you could say, news outlets calling for outright monetization of these expenditures. This means that the money created to fight the virus will be created by the central banks, and it is also generally acknowledged that even if this means an increase in the debt to GDP ratio of countries, this is largely a fictitious debt because it's debt owed by the central bank, which the central bank has no reason to ask taxpayers to pay back.
So, Thomas, just so I can be clear, then, is your position that the magic money tree basically does exist, and we've now discovered it, and that actually we should have been shaking it years ago?
Well, I wouldn't use the term magic money tree because it's obviously pretty loaded. But I mean, it's not my opinion that that money is created out of thin air. It's a fact, and money is created out of thin air by central banks, and it's also created out of thin air by private banks. And in fact, the Bank of England felt compelled to publish a series of papers a few years back, precisely to explain that this is how money works. And anyone can find the papers on the website of the Bank of England. So this is a fact. Money today, we live in fiat currency systems, which means that money is not backed by gold. It's not backed by any other metal. Advanced countries don't peg their currencies to other currencies. So they're free to create as much money as they want.
I'm going to bring in Julian now. So Julian, what you've been patiently sitting there while Thomas explains his view.
Yeah.
It does seem amazingly striking that suddenly all of those queries we heard during the austerity years have vanished, and everyone is happy to borrow these huge sums overnight. How is Thomas wrong, or is he wrong?
Okay, well, he's right on some facts, but frankly, they're not actually particularly interesting facts. I don't think anybody has ever argued that central banks can't create money if they want to. They can create much money as they like. I don't think anybody's ever argued that sovereign countries can avoid going bankrupt if they want to by simply printing more money. I think that sort of discussion is almost irrelevant. I don't think anybody's arguing with that. I think that the problem I've got with what Thomas and others are saying is that they're confusing money with the goods and services that money is used to buy. That is the thing that is in limited supply, the goods and services. So yes, you can create as much money as you like, but unless the goods and services are there to that you can then go and buy, then all that happens is that you create inflation. Or put another way, if the only requirement that you had was that you're a sovereign country that can print your own money, then why aren't developing countries in the emerging world, why don't they have world-class healthcare? If all they need to do is print money to buy things, then why are they not so much better off than they are? Or alternatively, why don't we just add a naught to the end of all of our banknotes and incomes and so on, then we'd be 10 times better off. I think you need to take account also of what the constraints in the economy are. To be fair, though, I think I probably would agree with Thomas on some things. I think when you're in a deep recession, when there's plenty of spare capacity around, and when interest rates are very low, so there's very little cost to government borrowing, in those circumstances, then yes, I think there's a lot more room for government spending and for that to be financed in some way by the central bank directly or indirectly. So in that sense, I probably agree that some of the austerity we saw in the early 2010s was unnecessary and the burden wasn't evenly shared. But I'm not sure that that's relevant now when you have a shock that's hit both the supply and the demand side of the economy. I'd be very worried if you pumped in enormous amounts of money over the next few years when the supply side of the economy is still struggling. And I think in those circumstances, the outcome is far more likely to be high inflation than it is the strong economic recovery that we all want.
So as the kind of independent observer of this, I'm surprised that you only used the word inflation at the end of your answer there, because traditionally the kind of riposte for why currencies and central banks can't just print money for everything they require is that it would lead to super high inflation. That doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. So why have we not seen inflation in response to all the quantitative easing and the money printing?
Because we haven't actually seen the monetization that Thomas is talking about. I mean, the governments in lots of countries are borrowing lots of money, but that hasn't led to the sort of explosion of the money supply that would lead to very high inflation further down the line. At least not yet. I mean, there are signs of that starting to happen. Monetary growth in the US is now quite rapid. It's starting to pick up in the UK as well. But for the moment, actually, the monetary growth numbers are still quite subdued because we haven't seen the monetization of debt that Thomas suggests might be happening at some point in the future. If we were to see that significant outright monetization of debt, then I will be talking more about inflation than I am now.
So is that a prediction then? Can we put that on our little ledger of predictions then? If we start seeing large-scale monetization of debts by Western governments, the outcome will be high inflation.
Well, at the very least, it would be a big step increase in the price level. And that's another possibility, that if they increase the money supply by, 20%, then you might get a 10-20% increase in the price level. That doesn't necessarily mean that inflation is permanently higher. And there might be some advantages in an increase in the price level because it reduces the cost of debt. If you're a debtor and all prices and incomes rise by 10%, then the burden of supporting debt is reduced. So it's possible there's a step increase in the price level, but we know that that's very dangerous. Step increases in the price level tend to become permanent. If inflation expectations take off, then we have seen in many countries in the past where countries have printed enormous amounts of money. When the capacity is not there in the economy to supply the goods and services that money is being used to buy, then you do see much, much higher rates of inflation.
Thomas, I'm going to come back to you now. I think we can call that a non-denial denial from Julian, because there was some agreeing with you there, really, that actually these are different times and different things are possible.
I just want to restate the fact that I'm glad that Julian finds these things so obvious as to be uninteresting. But I want to restate the fact that this is not the narrative we've been hearing by any establishment politician, by any major party in government, by any major government, by any major financial institution. And I'm thinking of the IMF, the World Bank, you name it. So the narrative that governments can create as much money as they want, but they have to be careful of inflation, is not the narrative that we've been hearing. The narrative we've been hearing is that our governments are running out of money, and anyone can Google government running out of money, and they'll see hundreds of articles come up with hundreds of quotes by politicians and senior economists. So I just want to repeat that this. Again, this testifies to the capacity of establishment economists to reinvent themselves and to adapt to changing situations, whereby now they're saying, we've always said this, everyone's always said this, this is obvious. Well, in fact, this is not obvious at all, and we've been hearing the exact opposite for decades, and that narrative has been used to impose punishing austerity on millions of people. So I'm glad, we agree on this now, but this is not what we've been hearing for a very, very long time.
Can I ask for my benefit then, if there was this obvious capability to basically print money, and that's been there for all these years, what sort of world do you think we'd be living in now if governments had realised that earlier? So you would have liked to see that throughout the period since the crisis or before the crisis?
First of all, let me be clear about this is another point that I want to restate. What I'm describing is not how I would like things to work, or what MMT or modern monetary theory describes is not an ideal system that we should work towards. It simply describes how things already work in our modern monetary systems and have worked since 1971, i.e. since the dollar since Nixon unshackled the dollar from gold, and it essentially ushered us into the fiat currency system that we live in today. So governments already operate this way. So governments already essentially spend, I'm talking about advanced governments such as the US, the UK, they already can spend and do spend whatever they want. And then they subsequently decide to recoup some of that money through taxation or through issuing debt. But governments already, governments are perfectly aware of the fact that they don't face financial constraints. And I think we see this most obviously when there's a war to finance. And suddenly trillions and trillions of pounds and dollars and euros are pulled out of a magic hat. No one ever asks where that money comes from. Never. How many trillions of pounds, how many trillions of dollars were spent on wars over the past 2 decades? Did anyone ever ask where that money came from? Obviously, it was created out of thin air. And the same goes when it comes, and in fact, the neoliberals are way more aware of how the system works than left-wingers are. In fact, often neoliberal governments have run higher deficits than third-way governments. In fact, Reagan run much higher deficits than Clinton did, just to give an example. And so, when it comes to cutting taxes for the rich, for example, governments are perfectly aware of the fact that they don't face any financial constraints. And so this is not an ideal system that we should work towards. Okay. This is how the system already works. What we're simply saying is that if the power of the currency issuer can be used to finance wars, then it should also be used to improve the well-being of citizens through increased welfare spending, health spending, job creation, and so on.
Tom, I'm going to move, as it were, that is our first topic then, which is the money supply. Let's move to the second one, and let's go straight to Julian for this. So the second point that Thomas was talking about in his piece was this whole question of the sort of hyper-integrated supply chains, and this whole idea that the kind of the geographical proximity was not important. and that you don't need to have key industries at home. You can rely on, last-minute deliveries from other sides of the world, and that this whole COVID-19 crisis has exposed how unbelievably fragile that world was. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, there's certainly an element of truth in that. I mean, clearly, lots of the supply chains that the world economy relies on are very fragile. They're vulnerable to all sorts of shocks, and maybe coronavirus has proven to be far bigger shock than anybody anticipated. But yes, if you have long stretched supply chains, then there are risks around that. Brexiteers, for example, have been saying that for some time about our dependence on imports from the EU. So I don't think that's a particularly new thing. Again, I would stress though two bigger points. One is that globalization has brought huge benefits to the world economy, and anybody who understands the basic economics of free trade will recognize the advantages of international trade in terms of better specialization and economies of scale. And we can go back hundreds of years to classical economists like Ricardo and Adam Smith to show the benefits of free trade. The second thing, though, I think it's a little bit odd to worry too much about the impact of coronavirus on these long supply chains, when at the moment we can't even walk down to our local shops as much as we would want to because of the lockdown restrictions and so on. There's also a point
I think there's the whole idea about, we don't have a single vaccine manufacturer in the United Kingdom, for example. Do you think that's a mistake?
No, I don't actually, because if we have a situation where we're short of something in a globalized economy, then we can source it from somewhere else. Whereas if everybody were having to rely on local production, that would be hugely inefficient. I think in practice, by the way, coronavirus would have overwhelmed the ability of any country to supply as much PPE, personal protective equipment, or vaccines or medicines as it would have required. I think it's much better to have a situation where we can trade freely with the rest of the world, and those countries that do have the capacity to produce more, so for example, Turkey at the moment, we can import more PPE or whatever else it might be from them, rather than having huge amounts of spare capacity lying idle at times when it's not required.
So I'm just going to take advantage of my fair position here and ask you another follow-up question before I go back to Thomas. Is there any aspect of this hyper-globalized neoliberal world that you regret, Julian, or you do think, in the light of recent events, was misguided?
Not in the light of the coronavirus crisis. I think there are, some valid concerns about lots of things that, have been a feature of the world over the last 10, 20, 30 years. So we can talk about, the impact on the environment and, maybe what's happening in China in terms of the way that the Chinese government has responded, or equally the US government, the way that that's responded. But possibly these are things that have been flagged up by coronavirus, but I don't think they're necessarily fundamental flaws in the neoliberal or the capitalist model.
China is one that people have to quote, isn't it? That the whole sort of neoliberal delusion and 90s onwards, that by engaging with China and bringing it into the World Trade Organization, everything it would liberalize, and patently that hasn't happened. Do you remember what you were arguing in the 90s or the 2000s or on this subject?
I'd actually argue that the opening up of China to the world economy has been a huge positive, both for China and for the rest of the world. I mean, the increase in sort of production possibilities, the driving down of costs, and the benefits to the more than 1 billion people who live in China itself. Now, there is a debate to be had about how evenly or unevenly those benefits have been shared. So I think if you were, I'm British, but if I were American, I'd be focusing much more on the fact that the benefits of globalization haven't been equally shared. But in order to share those benefits, you've got to have them in the first place. And I think this is the old analogy about the size of the cake. I think globalization has significantly increased the size of the cake. We might argue that cake should have been more evenly shared, As a, if you like, a neoliberal, I don't have too much of a problem as it happens with slightly higher taxes and using that to redistribute income from the rich to the poor. What I do have a problem with is the government spending that money rather than individuals. So if you're arguing in favour of the state raising a bit of money to give it to poorer people for them to spend, I'm happy about that. What I'm not happy about is the idea the government itself is making loads of decisions about how that money is spent. I think that sort of state planning model is the one that I would argue most strongly against.
Thomas, what do you think? State planning, is it? I presume you're in favour of it.
Well, I think we already live in a largely planned economy. The problem is that the decisions that affect the economy and that affect the lives of each and every one of us, that affect the lives of millions of people, are taken by multinationals, very large multinationals that are not accountable to anyone. They're taken by very large financial institutions, which, by the way, create most of the money in our economy. Planning, you could say, how much money is created is pumped into the economy, and we have little or no oversight over that. So, as citizens, we think we live in in democracies, but I would say that a true democracy is one where citizens, through the democratic electoral system, are able to influence the big questions. What is produced? How do we produce it? What do we want to produce, and for what? For what reason? How should money and wealth be distributed in society, and so on? So at the moment, we have little or no say over these decisions, which are taken by essentially private institutions, and this goes right. It goes back to the root of money. I mean, money is an essential, is at the basis of our economy. Just to go back to what we were saying, or what Julian was talking about earlier, of course, MMT is perfectly aware of the fact that when you spend, you have to take into account what the economy can absorb. But it's also true that productive capacity is not a given. Productive capacity can be increased, and we live in monetary production economies, some people have called them, which means that to get production in motion, you need money. And anyone who's ran a business knows that, before you can do anything, you need to get the money. And so I would say that that's why I would say the money supply has to be democratized, because at the moment, the money supply is essentially managed by private banks, and they decide according to strictly profit-based logics, who gets the money, where the money goes to. And I think it's proven over the past decades to be very inefficient at allocating resources. And just very briefly, on the question of China, I wouldn't say that China, an argument that we often hear is that, free trade has lifted billions of people out of poverty. Well, in fact, China and the sort of East Asian economies account for much of that poverty reduction. But these countries haven't reduced poverty by following the kind of neoliberal free trade prescriptions. Countries like China and the East Asian tigers, they've done that by following protectionist policies, by pursuing industrial policies, by tightly controlling the economy, by, in many cases, controlling the credit, with the public credit institutions being in public hands. And China is an obvious example of this. So, China has lifted almost 1 billion people out of poverty, but it hasn't done this by adhering to the neoliberal framework. It's done this by following a largely protectionist policy, which is what Western countries have followed to develop in the first place.
Well, so now, Thomas, the world is moving in your direction by the sounds of it. I mean, we seem to be taking where America, Western governments are more protectionist than they were even a small couple of years ago. You've mentioned these huge borrowing and so on. Do you feel that the argument is moving in your direction? I mean, perhaps the West is becoming more Chinese.
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that the hyper-globalization model has failed. I think it's no longer sustainable. It's no longer sustainable in social and political terms. I mean, one can argue as much as you want of the cake getting bigger and so on, but when millions of Western workers have seen their unionized, high-paid jobs being shipped off to China, simply saying we're going to tax the rich a bit, and give you a few handouts, that's not going to cut it. And so I think people want jobs. They don't want to be helped. They don't want handouts from the state. So they don't want what the neoliberals are prescribing. They want good, well-paid, high-quality jobs. And I think that entails bringing back onshoring once again certain productions that can easily be relocalized, with no serious negative consequences. In fact, with quite a few benefits, I would say, in terms of a good, high-quality jobs. And so I think that's it's the system has become unsustainable.
Julian, I think you might have to unmute as well. I think if we're gonna hear you. Just hit it one more time, so we can. There we go. So, let me put the similar kind of question to you then. I mean, having heard that, I said, is the West becoming more Chinese to Thomas, or is he winning the argument? Do you feel you're losing the argument, and that Western governments are erring too much from the sort of neoliberal rules?
First of all, I just said that there's so much there from that I disagreed with. I just want to pick up on one big thing first. It's the idea that a liberal economy is inconsistent with democracy. I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think that the best way to guide an economy is for individuals themselves to make decisions about what they buy, where they spend their money. Most of what companies do is about meeting consumer demand. So we're talking casually about multinationals controlling the world. Multinationals can only be successful if they buy, make, and sell things that people want to buy, particularly if they're in highly competitive markets. So the successful companies at the moment are those who've invented stuff, they've created stuff that we all want to buy. And that's been a good thing. It's massively improved consumer welfare. I think there are some legitimate concerns at the margin about crony capitalism. There are some markets where some participants become too big, and we might want regulation in those areas. But generally speaking, it's the free market economy that delivers the sort of freedom of choice for individuals to do whatever they want, to buy what they want. I think that applies to labour markets as well. I'm very wide with the idea that the government is the best person to decide the industries of the future, who you should work for, what the terms of your employment should be. We all want better paid jobs and more flexibility and so on. But I think that's best driven in a market economy rather than the government deciding what sorts of jobs people are allowed to have and who they should work for and what their conditions should be. So fundamentally, I just got a different vision of how the world should be run. In terms of how the debate is going, it is tough being a neoliberal, however you put it. There are lots of very trendy things to say on Twitter about how the evils of capitalism, how fat cat bosses are running the world, and all that sort of thing, and how much better it would be if we had sort of people's democracy. But we know from looking at almost every socialist economy in history, when you talk about what actually happens in practice, is that very quickly economies get run by small groups of vested interests, whether that's organised labour or crony capitalists or whatever. That power very quickly gets taken away from the people, that those economies start to grind to a halt, and people shift from saying, oh, that's a brilliant socialist paradigm, to saying, oh, that wasn't real socialism at all. The simple reality is that capitalist economies, or free market or liberal economies, whatever you like to call them, are much more successful at creating economic growth, creating jobs. And it's only those strong economies that then have the potential to fund welfare systems and strong health care and so on. Now, sometimes governments are not good at translating one to the other, but that's a failure of government. It's not a failure of the underlying economic model. So,
can I just ask, Julian, if it was going so well, why has it happened that across the world people turned against the model that you're talking about? Why is it so fashionable now to make the complaints that you're talking about? Why would that happen if it was working well for people?
Okay, well, people are certainly willing to complain about it in public, but look who's actually in government. Donald Trump is in government in the US. We had a conservative government for 10 plus years in in the UK. There are plenty of people willing to talk about socialist ideals, but they very, very rarely actually seem to get voted into power. And the closest we got, of course, in the UK was a few years ago with the general election that Corbyn nearly won. But those ideas were pretty much roundly rejected in the latest general election in the UK. So I think there's a difference between what people are willing to, what people sort of say and what they tweet on Twitter, and what they, rather than how they actually vote. I think most people do seem to recognise that in the long run, you do need a sort of long, strong, liberal free market economy. And that, while intellectuals may be in favour of all this sort of fluffier stuff about, people's democracy and socialism and so on, in practice, people aren't willing to vote for it.
Thomas, I'm going to let you respond to that, and then I want to move on to the EU in a moment. So keep it brief if you can.
Okay, well, very brief. On the question of democracy, I think most people would consider democracy to be more about being able to choose what you buy. Because if that's all that democracy boils down to, then why do we even have elections in the first place? So, I mean, we might as well do away with elections and just just allow people to exercise their free will on the market. Of course, most people understand democracy to be about more than that. It's about deciding collectively the direction we want our societies to go into, and in order to and for that to happen, governments need to governments being the only instrument through which people collectively can have a say. They need to have the power to intervene in the economy. In fact, when you straitjacket governments excessively, and this allows us to move on to the EU, such as in the Eurozone, what you get is not greater freedom, it's not greater political stability, it's the exact opposite. And we saw this even back in the 30s with the gold standard, which according to many people paved the way to fascism. So straitjacketing governments is and moving putting those decisions in the hands of undemocratic institutions is very dangerous, I think.
Thomas, just to make sure that we get an answer on Julian's last point, though, because that if you're right, which seems to make sense, that democracy and government should be the place where people choose what kind of future they want, why is it that centre-right governments keep getting elected?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would say that the left-right distinction doesn't make that much sense anymore. I mean, if we look at the case of the U.S., obviously the Democratic Party was way more pro-market and neoliberal than Trump was. So arguing that because Trump's victory is a demonstration that people are voting neoliberal doesn't really hold water, because clearly people voted for the anti-neoliberal candidate. Now, whether he fell through, whether he went through with those promises or not is another question. But clearly his narrative was much less neoliberal than Hillary's narrative, and I think we can all agree on that. But of course, it's true. I mean, there's huge pressure, as bad as the situation may get. Obviously, there's huge pressure from the media, from established politicians, to seriously question the system, and liberals are very good at this. I mean, liberals have defended every possible system in the past, from colonialism to slavery to eugenics, you name it. You go back and you can find a liberal who will defend, everyone defended slavery in the U.S. Many well-respected liberals defended slavery, defended colonialism, and so they're very good at defending the current system and arguing that as bad as it may be, any possible alternative is bound to be worse. And this is a very strong narrative. And of course, we know that the media is not that very democratic, and so people aren't getting access to the full story. And I think the whole issue of how monetary systems work is a good example. We're only now hearing the truth after 30 years of propaganda.
Okay, Thomas. So we've come to the bit that I was sort of quite looking forward to, because I think you might agree with each other on this point, which is that multinational institutions like the European Union have not been adequate to the times recently, and that's why people have been turning against them. I mean, let me go to Julian if I can. So we have, as it were, a left point of harmony, which is that the European Union hasn't really cut it.
Yeah, well, I've got some sympathy for the European Union during this crisis, because a lot of the ways that you deal with coronavirus are the sorts of things you need to do as a nation state rather than as some sort of bloc. And the European Union, although it's not actually done very much itself, it has at least stepped aside and made sure, for example, that those governments among member states who needed to spend a lot more money on job retention schemes, whatever, have been able to do so without falling foul of state aid rules. So I don't necessarily criticise the EU too much in this case, but where I do criticise the EU, ironically, it's probably because I don't think it's neoliberal enough. So all of the extensive regulations that the EU expects every member state to meet as a condition for trading with other countries, the trade barriers that the EU imposes on trade with the rest of the world. I mean, to some extent, you could say that EU itself is a free trading bloc, one of the world's biggest, but also it's protectionist, because a condition for that is that they have common external tariffs and trade barriers against other countries. So there are some ways in which I'd actually criticise the EU as not being neoliberal enough.
You were in favour of Brexit on the grounds that the EU was too protectionist.
Yeah, I think could be part of the story. I mean, as it happens, I was largely in favour of Brexit for more sort of political than narrowly economic reasons to do with sovereignty, and I do believe that nation states are the best building block on which to run an economy. But I think there are good economic arguments in favour of Brexit as well, around better forms of regulation that might be more appropriate for individual economies. That would typically mean lower regulation rather than more, but might be more in some areas. I think more free trade, which is something that the membership of the EU restricts. So yes, I'd basically say that the EU wasn't neoliberal enough.
I'm going to Thomas, we're going to come to you now, because about 2 sentences ago, Julian said that he believes that the nation state is the proper building block for an economy. Do we have a moment of agreement?
Absolutely. But I mean, again, this is perfectly consistent with neoliberalism. I mean, people, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about, we could debate for hours about what neoliberalism actually is and actually means. I think what most people take neoliberalism to be an ideology that essentially advocates, the state completely moving out of the economy and just letting the economy manage itself. But in fact, if you go and read, sort of classic neoliberal texts, so von Mises and even Hayek and people like them, they didn't argue for the state to disappear. They argued for the need for a strong state to create the conditions for a free market, which in itself requires market intervention, because you have to build the conditions for a market. And also you have to put the market beyond the reach of politics. This was an essential argument of the neoliberals, and so in this sense. Of course, I find it completely understandable that a neoliberal would advocate for the importance of the nation state, because that's what all the great neoliberals have advocated for. But it's also why I would describe the EU as very much neoliberal, because what the EU has done is use not in this case a nation state. It hasn't used the nation state. It's used a supranational architecture to implement the same measures, to sort of put the economy beyond the reach of politics by constitutionalizing the free movement of capital, of labor, of trade, by putting various obstacles in the face of, for example, state aid, by governments, support to local industries, and so on, and most obviously in the Eurozone by placing what is a cardinal principle of sovereignty, but I would say also of democracy, and that is monetary fiscal policy, beyond the reach of electorates, to a degree that we don't see anywhere else in the world, by transferring these powers to a supranational central bank, which is not only independent of governments, but from which governments are dependent.
Do you want to you're talking to us from Italy. Do you want to see Italy leave the Eurozone, leave the European Union entirely? What would you like to see happen there?
Well, I mean, I'm definitely in favor of Italy leaving the euro, but I mean, more in general, I would like to see the euro dismantled. I think it would be a positive step forward for pretty much all countries except Germany and their sort of export obsessed friends up north. But I think most countries would benefit from leaving the EU, just like most countries benefited from dismantling the gold standard in the 1930s.
Is there any chance, do you think, of Italy post-crisis leaving the Eurozone? And if so, how would that be? Are we talking about a Salvini government doing it, or what are the prospects of any movement in that direction?
I mean, people's opinion about the EU and about the euro have shifted a lot in recent years, and especially during the crisis. So recent polls all show very strong hostility from a majority of citizens now vis-a-vis the EU and the euro. So clearly that's a fact to deal with. But I mean, of course, it all boils down to politics. Will anyone be able to build a coalition in order to bring the country out of the euro? I mean, technically it can be done, and it wouldn't be in any way as nearly as catastrophic as people say. It's the politics about it that is really hard. So it all boils down. I mean, clearly, the elections in a few years. If the center right continues to be a majority in the country, that's going to shift. That's going to have a big. That could have a very big impact on Italy's euro membership. But I think we'll see quite a few surprises even before then. I mean, there's a few years left to the elections, and Italy is going to come out of this crisis completely with an economy completely wrecked. And with very little ability to put into place the economic interventions that would be needed. We're in for a very rough ride.
Before I come to Julian for his to sum up, as it were, from his side, I just want to get a last thought from you because we're nearly out of time. It seems to me, sitting here, that the world is moving in your direction, Thomas. You still sound almost defensive, as if the great powers aren't going to move in your direction, and it's all going to stay the same, and the neoliberals are going to win again, and Italy won't move. But actually, everything that I would expect you would hope to be happening seems to be happening. This is, I would have thought, a huge moment of opportunity for people who view the world like you do. But do you feel hopeful?
No, not necessarily, because we've been here before. I mean, capitalist crises can go two ways. Of course they can. Again, if we go back and look at the 1930s, they can go in the direction of greater democracy, greater welfare. If we look at Roosevelt in the U.S., for example, and the New Deal, but capitalist crises can also go in a very different direction, which is the direction that we saw, in a number of European countries in the 1930s. And so what I'm worried about is that we're witnessing the collapse of neoliberalism, but the socialist, the democratic socialist alternative that I would like to see is still relatively weak. And so, it's the paradigm change won't necessarily go in our direction, if we don't, pull up our sleeves in the coming months and years.
Okay. Julian, let's come back to you. As usual, there's the muting issue. We have to make sure you're unmuted. But sum up how you see the world then, because, we've heard from Thomas there that he doesn't feel like he's winning this argument. He still thinks you neoliberals are either going to win again, like you always do, or worse, there'll be some sinister, even worse regime that will take power. Are you? Do you feel like you are losing, even though everyone else thinks you're winning?
Well, I sometimes think we're losing in social media, in the Twitter sphere and things like that. I think some of the arguments that I make are incredibly unpopular, whereas the arguments that Thomas and others are making are very, very, very popular. But I think in terms of economic reality, then neoliberalism has been winning and will continue to win compared to the alternatives. As it happens, I didn't recognise a lot of what Thomas was saying when he was describing neoliberalism. I think that neoliberals recognise that there is a role for the state. There are lots of things that the state can do far more efficiently than the market. Public health responding to a crisis like coronavirus is an obvious example of that. There's clearly a case for the state to step in and take the lead there. And during a very deep recession, I think there's clearly a case for the government to spend more than it otherwise would do. I mean, the idea of counter-cyclical economic policies in those circumstances, I think, is uncontroversial. But when it comes down to the bigger structural issues, I think there's overwhelming evidence that sort of liberal, flexible economies based on individual choice are far more efficient at delivering gains in welfare and better goods and services than anything else. And also that the economies that are more liberal, I think, will recover more strongly from this crisis. If you just take one single example, the German healthcare system seems to be managing much better than the British healthcare system. And that's because the German healthcare system is decentralized. It's driven far more by sort of free market competition and free market principles than the British one. We also see, of course, lots of competition from different companies to meet demand during these exceptional circumstances. And I think those countries that have lots of companies competing to deliver goods online or to create a new vaccine, they're going to do better than others. So there are lots of ways in which I think neoliberalism, in the sense of a free market competitive economy, some of those advantages have actually come through as a result of this crisis. And people don't necessarily want to go to a socialist planned economy where I think the sort of rigidities of that would actually be a disadvantage in dealing with a crisis like this.
Okay, well, thank you so much to both Thomas, Fazi and Julian Jessop. That was absolutely fascinating. We looked into this strange word neoliberalism that nobody seems to like, even neoliberals, and seemed to find, I suppose, in a way, the opposite of what I was expecting, because everybody talks about neoliberalism cracking up and the protection is going up and authoritarian regimes are popping up everywhere, and it seems to be a dark moment. But actually, both its critics and its defenders here seemed quite confident that the underlying structures are actually going to withstand, whether you like them or not. So there you have it. That was a different view. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been watching Lockdown TV from Unheard. We will be back at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, talking in depth with Yanis Varoufakis, the economist and politician and thinker from Greece. See you then.